to the house, you'll be happy to know. I felt that it wasn't proper to kind of just give short shrift as I had done. But I did buy a bunch of his books in the gift shop. Now, let's get to Canada's history and some of the ancestors we have to recognize in our story, because I think for far too often Canada has been good about passing judgment on social injustice around the world while hiding it at home. This is one of my greatest heroes. His name is Peter Henderson Bryce. His brother actually is the founder of the University of Manitoba and University of Winnipeg, George Bryce. So, but Peter Henderson Bryce is a medical person, right? Much like you, sir. And he graduated from the University of Toronto when Canada was only 9 years old, was considered to be one of the top international experts on infectious disease, was the president of the American Public Health Association. And he actually saved thousands of people's lives. He wrote Canada's first health code, which was replicated all over the territories and provinces and in the US. But he was erased from Canadian history books for what he did at age 51. He became the chief medical health officer at Indian Affairs. And he went out and documented the death rates of children in the schools. He found they were dying at a rate of 25% per year. And if you followed the children over 3 years, almost half of them will have passed away. And in File Hills Residential School, which is the only school that kept complete records, 76% of the children were dead by the time they were 16. Now, what did Dr. Bryce notice? He noticed that the funding the government was giving to healthcare to the population in Ottawa alone was 3 times higher than for all First Nations people across the country. He said, even that out, and actually implement a bunch of practical reforms, like not putting sick children in with healthy children, making sure the schools were well ventilated, do all those things, and you could save these children's lives. The cost to the government of Canada was $10,000 to $15,000 in a time when the government's budget was over $100 million. The government said, no, we're not going to do it. Dr. Bryce, having sworn an oath to people's health, could not morally remain silent. So his report gets leaked to the major newspapers. This is the Ottawa Citizen. It was then called the Evening Citizen. It appeared in the Globe. It appeared as far west as the Victoria Colonist. And as you can see, editors thought it was important too, because they put it right on the front page of the paper above the fold. One of the people reading this was a lawyer. Who knows of Blake's law firm? All you law students should know about that, right? Well, the founder of that, one of the founding brothers, is Samuel Hume Blake, and he read that. And he said that in that Canada failed to obviate the preventable causes of death that brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So that's what people of the period back then thought about this. It was not only immoral, it was probably illegal, right? And yet it was not enough to get the conscience of the nation, to get people of the period, people just like us, to rise up and stop this inequality from happening. We know, thanks to the stories of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that at least 4,000 to 6,000 children died. Many of those children could still not have perished had Dr. Bryce's reforms been implemented. And indeed, I would argue the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision would have not needed to be argued had someone embraced the basic tenets of what Bryce was arguing, is that every human being has an entitlement to equal treatment and dignity in the provision of public services. That's really what Bryce was arguing. The man who said no, it's interesting, is also, so you have Dr. Bryce, a public servant. You have the man who said no, also a public servant. Bryce gets erased from the public history, and actually the government of Canada retaliated against him. They denied him positions for which he was eminently qualified. They stopped him from presenting at conferences. They tried to disparage his reputation, all kinds of nasty things, and eventually push him out of the public service. But the man who said no actually gets lots of awards from the government and from society in general. So this is Duncan Campbell Scott, and he was, interestingly enough, for those of us in academia, you know the Royal Society. Duncan Campbell Scott was president of the Royal Society in 1922. The same year, Bryce, out of frustration, publishes something called A National Crime, detailing all of his reports and the letters back and forth to government, trying to get them to save these kids' lives. It's circulating around Ottawa at the same time he's president. He's given honorary degrees. He's actually, when he retires, the government of Canada held a huge reception for him because of his loyalty to the Crown and to the public service, right? And he actually is on the Persons of Significance list at Heritage Canada. They just recently took that whole list down, but until they took it down off the website, he was actually a person of significance, Canadian significance. Because in his off time, he was a Confederate poet, right? So we promote the people who do the wrong thing, have the moral courage to, moral cowardice and do the wrong thing, and we quash down the people who have the moral courage to do the right thing. And I don't think that's unique to that time. Unfortunately, we see it playing out even today in the populist movement that you were talking about, Doctor. And that's why it's so essential that we hold up these people who are morally courageous and we all stand with them, right? So what does it mean when you're treated unequally? Because these inequalities for First Nations kids are cross-cutting. And they've been made possible by a very designed and intentful narrative in the public that First Nations get the same as everybody else, plus bonus services because you're First Nations. And we should be grateful for what we received is the other narrative, right? Whenever there's a government announcement. The reality is that from numerous reports, First Nations people across every public service get less services, less quality of services than everyone else. And you don't need to be an economist to figure this out. You know, in Manitoba, there's First Nations that don't have clean drinking water. Why is that, right? We can you watch the hurricane that just hit Florida. They will have clean drinking water into those hurricane things within a few hours. In fact, it's probably there already, right? We have the technology to do it, but we've chosen not to do it. And what it means for child welfare is those children who have gotten a multi-generational trauma of residential school get less services to be able to recover from that trauma across all dimensions of their lives. And then when they get to a point of crisis, there's less services to respond to them. And too often they're judged by a Canadian public as if they get more, right? And so what happens is that they start to believe they're not worth the money. That's the whole tragedy of this structural discrimination, is that children and young people themselves don't know they're getting less. They just know life is a lot easier for other kids. And so it's not surprising to me that we see the tragic suicide rates that we do amongst First Nations children across the country. If we treated other groups of children unequally like that, we'd get that same outcome, right? And in child welfare, we all assume that kids end up in child welfare because parents make bad decisions. But that's not the case with First Nations kids, what you can see in the data. Surely some parents do, but the overrepresentation is driven by poverty, poor housing, and caregiver substance misuse related to mental health. All things that could respond to services if they were provided equally, right? But here we have a vacuum of services where the Canadian government was giving about 70 cents on the dollar in child welfare services compared to non-Indigenous children who didn't have the same kind of hardships. And where those shortfalls were most extreme was in prevention services to keep kids safely in their families. The result is dramatic overrepresentation. But I don't like that word. It's too easy to say. And so this figure actually comes from a Government of Canada spreadsheet. It covers the number of nights that First Nations children spent in care away from their families. And that's the way kids count things, right? Those of you who have kids or no kids, they don't count it by, I'm overrepresented by 12 times. They say, how many sleeps till I see my mom, right? That's what they do, right? And if you count that up, it's over 78 million nights between 1989 and 2017. That's over 213,000 years of childhood. This is the cost of that inequality continuing. This is the cost of adults not acting on solutions that are already on the books, right? And this is why I'm not thankful. I won't be thankful for incremental equality, and I don't think you should be either. In my view, these kids are worth the money. They're worth every single penny. And none of us should be grateful or satisfied until that happens, right? Otherwise, we're just oiling that machine of incremental equality, where it's okay for one group of kids to get less than everybody else. And if the incremental approach worked, wouldn't kids be equal by now? Well, this has been going on for 152 years, right? At least from Bryce's report, that was 111 years ago. So why haven't we gotten anywhere further than what I often hear in the media from different elected officials is that we're making good first steps? Well, I don't want to be making another second step 111 years from now. We have got to, as a country, reject any form of racial discrimination against children. So this is why, after all of these reports, I really realized that it wasn't another report that was needed. In fact, we had the answers to do the right thing. It was the people of the period having the collective will to stand up in peaceful and respectful ways, but also taking mechanisms in our own hands to force the government to do the right thing, because it was clear they were not choosing to do the right thing on their own. And that's why we filed the case, right? And I remember when we filed the case, people said, well, you know, you're a teeny tiny organization, you're going to do it along with the Assembly of First Nations, and that's great, but you're federally funded, so you're probably going to lose all your money, and then there will be no one to speak out for First Nations kids. And there was some real truth to that, right? I mean, a lot of organizations are afraid of speaking up against the government because they can cut your funding. But we had a great teaching from an elder who said, never fall in love with the Caring Society. And never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the kids, because there might come a time when you have to sacrifice all those things for them. And that happened. Within 30 days, we lost all of our government money, right? But I really feel that's our job as adults, to stand up for kids, right? These kids and these families were living with as much dignity as they could, and under very difficult circumstances. The last thing they needed to do is look at the Caring Society and see us under our desks hiding, right? It's our job to try and stand up against this injustice, especially when we had people like Jordan River Anderson, who is such a great hallmark for all of us. This is one of my heroes, along with Dr. Bryce. And I was just talking to Amy Kraft, who some of you know, and I know that some of you in the Children of Law have read about her work. And we were talking about the power of Jordan's spirit. Here's a little boy from Norway House Cree Nation who just wanted to grow up with his family. His family just wanted to have their baby home. He's born in 1999, and he has some medical needs that require him to stay in the hospital. But finally, there's a discharge plan, and everything is available for Jordan to go to a family home. I need to make that clear. The other thing you need to understand is if he was non-Indigenous, he would have gone home. But because he was First Nations, that triggered an argument within and between the province of Manitoba and the government of Canada. No one wanted to set a precedent of picking up a cost that another government might be responsible for. So the thing that they decided to do is argue individually about each item related to Jordan's care. Who's going to pay for the shower head? Who's going to pay for his wheelchair ramp? And the bureaucrats weren't bad people, but they're caught up in a system that reinforces structural discrimination against kids. It legitimizes it. It dehumanizes the children, and it puts first the loyalty to the organization, right? And so they would have these meetings, and they would tell you, likely, that they did everything they could. But the reality is that Jordan is in the hospital. And as a sister Jerlene said, eventually he dies of a broken heart. Because other little boys came into the ward, they weren't feeling very good. He sees them getting better, and they go home. And he was better, and he's trapped inside of this hospital. He dies there in 2005, never having spent a day in a family home. And I remember my heart really broke when a year later, the family invited me to his memorial service. And I was flying over Norway House. Has anybody been to Norway House Cree Nation? It's beautiful, eh? The territory with the lakes and everything. And I realized as I looked out the window, both when I was flying in and when I was driving, that I, a Gitxsan woman, was seeing things that Jordan never did. The only way he ever came back to his community was in a coffin, right? That's what the injustice feels like at a child level. But Jordan and his family left us a legacy to say that all First Nations children should have access to all public services when they need them. And there was a great moment of hope in 2007 when all the members of Parliament stood up across all party lines and unanimously voted for Jordan's principle. But then behind the scenes, what the bureaucrats did is crafted a definition so narrow, no child ever qualified. No child ever qualified. So in the decision, we said the inequalities in child welfare were discriminatory and racially discriminatory against at least 165,000 children and their families, and Canada's failure to implement Jordan's principle was racially discriminatory. The tribunal ruled and substantiated both of those things. This is 2016, right? It was in the front pages of the paper. The government welcomes the decision, which was very encouraging again. But I think I said that day of the news conference that change does not come in a decision. Change is measured in the lives of children themselves. And unfortunately, it took 5 non-compliance orders to get the government to begin to comply, and we're still working on it. The tribunal still got jurisdiction. So it says how entrenched it is, right, in the system. That even if you as a government person think there should be change and you've got these legal orders, to actually make change at the grassroots level is problematic. And where the government's kind of got caught up, as I see it, is they would make announcements of money, but they would back end the vast majority of the money for the last 5 years, meaning there was very little change for kids, but somehow they felt they had done something and that we should be thankful. And that was enough. And in the current last batch of announcements of $1.4 billion for child welfare, that's good, but none of that money has flowed to the kids, right? So it's still in federal coffers. So announcements in and of themselves are only good if they're actually made real in the lives of kids. So here's how you can report a Jordan's principle case. And if you report a child in need, you're honoring Jordan, but you're also helping other children. So you can call this number, and it's both in French and English, 24 hours around the clock, and it applies to all public services, so education, health, child welfare, anything. If you know of a child in need who needs a public service, get a hold of that phone number, right, and report that child so they can get the help they need. To the government's credit, they've at least provided, since the last non-compliance order on Jordan's principle, which was May of last year, 120,000 services and products to kids. There's still some issues, which I'm going to get into in a minute, but it's vitally important that we use the gift that Jordan and his family left to us. And it really is their gift to all of us, right? The other thing you can do is get involved and have a heart day. You have, I don't know how many students here at U of M, but I'm hoping all of you have Valentine's Day cards on February 14th. Because what the children did, who actually attended at the tribunal, the room was full of kids, by the way, when you came to the tribunal, of all diversities, who knew that this was fundamentally unfair and were determined to do something about it. So they went out with construction paper and they made Valentines for elected officials. And they write them and they say to dear so-and-so, Prime Minister, MP, legislature, I want to grow up in a country where First Nations kids get a fair chance to grow up in their families, get a good education, be healthy and proud of who they are. And we have a big one in Ottawa every February, and some kids from Manitoba come, usually in a big yellow school bus, which is awesome. And the great thing about Have a Heart Day is no adults speak, only the kids do, right? And you know what? Kids can see through the stuff. Like there's got to be a more kind of politically correct term than BS, but really that's what it is with adults, right? And they get right down to it and they'll say it, that this is wrong. And they'll always, what's so amazing to me is they'll say, dear Prime Minister, it's not right to give little kids less because of who they are or something like that. But they always sign their letter, love so-and-so. children knew what Mahatma Gandhi knew, is that best movements are built on love, right? Here's the other one where you can plant a heart garden in memory of the children that Bryce tried to save. And not just Dr. Bryce, by the way, but their own communities and nations as well spoke out during this time, right? So this is in June. You can do this. And this is Spirit Bear. And Spirit Bear is famous among kids. Who has actually met Spirit Bear? Yeah, one person has met. You guys are too old for the Spirit Bear demographic. But he was a teddy bear that witnessed all the hearings of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And originally, he was only a white bear. But the kids who came to the tribunal would come and get him. He'd disappear for the day. They'd tell him all the stories about what they learned that day. And then he'd come back with new sunglasses or a new shirt or something. So he's been dressed by the kids. And so the children all know him. And because he played such an important legal part in the case, he actually has his own barrister degree from Osgoode Law School. He doesn't have a degree from the University of Manitoba yet, but I'm sure that's forthcoming. Especially because isn't a bear your symbol here at the University of Manitoba? That's what I heard. He's been admitted to the bear by the Indigenous Bar Association, and he's a member of the Ottawa Civil Law Society. And the other thing that he has, we'll get to it in a minute, he is an author of a book that tells a true story of how kids who stood together during that case to stand up for justice. So I know Robbie's met Spirit Bear too. He's just been too shy. But, you know, it is kind of overwhelming when you're in the presence of greatness like that bear, right? It's kind of like, you know. He's a good bear. He's a good bear, yeah. And this is the book that we've written about Spirit Bear and about all the children. And it really is about how young children can really change the world for the better and have changed the world for the better. All the proceeds go to children's reconciliation projects. We don't take any of the money ourselves. And we're coming out with a second one, which is going to be out in December, and it's going to be called Fishing for Knowledge, Catching Dreams. And it's about traditional knowledge, residential schools, and Shannon Kustachin's Shannon's Dream at the end of it. So watch for that. And there's a free learning guide. We give them away free of charge to women's domestic violence shelters and to children's hospitals and to young children who are living in low-income families. So this last year, 15,000 of these copies have gone out to different kids across the country, and they can learn all about Jordan's principle in here too. A couple final things you can do is one is Bear Witness Day. Who here has a teddy bear? Oh, more than you that do. I have a teddy bear. I still have Dino the dinosaur. Does anyone remember Flintstones? I won him when I was 10 years old at a bonspiel at Bear Lake, BC, right? I still have him. So what you do is you bring out your teddy bear on May 10th. You bring it to work or to daycare or school to honor Jordan River Anderson because his favorite toy was a teddy bear. And then you use that opportunity to spread the word. So who here can get access to a teddy bear? Put your hand up. It's cool. Teddy bears can be cool. And in Norway House Cree Nation, they actually have a teddy bear parade where all the kids get involved. You can also have an ambassador. So the kids started to realize I like teddy bears, so I got a whole whack of them at my office. There was an overpopulation problem. And I thought, well, we have to do something good with these bears. So daycares and schools and even young people's organizations can apply to host one of our ambassadors. And then what you do is the children, young people, read books in the Indigenous language to the bear. They take them out to all reconciliation activities. They work with elders and have a naming ceremony. So these bears are actually all over the world now. They are in Australia, they're in New Zealand, and they're amongst First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities all over Canada. So that's just another free and fun learning activity for reconciliation. We have a journal, academic journal, like many other groups do, except we realized something important. And I think this is about my traditional upbringing before I was 5. Do you ever notice that as we get older, our academic journals, like the things that we read, get a lot more boring? You know, Like kids, they color, there's lots of sparkles. And we thought, you know, that's not right, right? We got to do something about that. So we have a peer-reviewed journal, but we decided, why don't we just have children do submissions and have children as the peer reviewers of all diversities, and they can all write about reconciliation. So we've done 2 editions, and you know, although we get many good academic articles, I'm sorry to say that the kids edition by far is our most popular. And the kids are serious peer reviewers too, right? Like they don't want, not everybody's article gets in, right? So this is a fun way we do things. Finally, with honoring Dr. Bryce and making things right with Duncan Campbell Scott, Dr. Bryce is buried in Beechwood Cemetery, not far from where I live. And we wanted to really honor this great man who had been forgotten in Canadian history. So we worked with his family. When I say we, it's historian John Malloy, Marie Wilson from the TRC, the Project to Heart, and others. And we put a historical plaque next to his grave. And you can see there that just before the ruling came out, I felt just a real importance that I go back and I see him. So before the world found out about the ruling, I got my gumboots on and went to Beechwood Cemetery and walked in the snow. And I read the decision to Dr. Bryce. I felt that I had to honor not only him, but everyone who came before him, who had stood up for the right thing. And what about Duncan Campbell Scott? Well, he got a plaque too. He's buried in Beechwood as well, just over the hill from Dr. Bryce. And his plaque was glowing, you know, like the recipient of many honorary degrees, Confederate poet. And I happened to go there, and I wanted to go there when I was in a good frame of mind because his daughter's also buried there. So I did the proper, the best I could do about a proper kind of mindset. But I walked by the plaque and I thought, this thing needs a revision. So we worked with Beechwood Cemetery, and now Duncan Campbell Scott has a new plaque. It includes the word Confederate poet, but it also includes cultural genocide. We feel that we have to tell the truth about people. And that doesn't mean demonizing people. He was a Confederate poet. But in order for him to be a teacher in reconciliation, we have to tell his complete story. And all of that research that we did in those plaques is now in elementary school curriculum in BC. You can download this free of charge. And there's a couple of movies you can watch, but I'm going to leave it there. And what I want to say to you is that you are the people of this period. And whether you know it or not, or feel capable enough, you are the very best hope that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children have. But it's not enough to care. You got to do something to make things better. You have to challenge your own acceptance of those colonial ideas that allowed for this discrimination to happen in whole or in part. And we must not be satisfied until every child in this country grows up in a country that really knows that they're worth the money. Because every child, regardless of what diversity, is worth the money to me. And I hope they're worth the money to you. I know that they're worth the money to Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you very much.